Hello, we're Board Game Opinions. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Mark.
And we're looking at Solomon Kane. Now, this is a big box cooperative adventure game. There's tons of stuff here.
Big box. Do you want to refer that? It's two big boxes.
Yes. Each box, actually, this is the box lid, but the box is this big and there's two of them. It's absolutely massive, this game. So, we're not going to try and explain the rules. There's just too much going on. So watch another video if you want to know how to play, but we're just going to give you our thoughts essentially.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about various different aspects of the game. What did we think of it? Because I certainly played this a lot since getting it, and I've been really enjoying it. But we'll start off with the components. There's some very nice miniatures in this game.
Yep.
What did you think of the component quality overall?
It's good, well casted. There's a reasonable amount of detail, and this one's got like almost snake skin on it, and it's each individual part is individually textured, so it looks like snake skin. Sure. I think that makes a nice big difference. But yeah, it's good quality. It's very good quality board game like components. It's good quality plastic as well. It's fairly firm.
This is Solomon Kane, the main character. We've got some baddies. And yes, each of us, interestingly, doesn't control Solomon Kane or a character on the board. We control these virtues, I think they're called, aren't they? But yes, the virtues are much bigger than everything else, and they can go on the board and wander around and help you.
And have some effects. Limited effects, but
yes.
some effects.
But the quality of the miniatures I thought were great.
Yes.
And there's tons of them. Like one of the boxes is like 2/3 full of miniatures. It's just loads and loads of miniatures. So this is a very small fraction of what you actually get in the game. It is scenario based. So you typically have a selection of maybe 10 miniatures for each scenario.
Yeah.
And then there are tons of scenarios that come with it. In terms of replayability, like it suffers, I suppose, from any other kind of adventure game in that once you've done the adventure once,
you know it's coming.
Yes, except there are so many adventures in the box. It solves that problem by the sheer volume of content here. There's absolutely tons of stuff here. Cubes and dice and cardboard counters all seem very good quality to me.
all high quality. The art's lovely.
Yeah.
The tile art's nice. It captures the feel and essence of Solomon Kane, which I don't know anything about the property outside of the game. I've heard of it, but it isn't a property I know much about. But it's very dark fantasy, and the tiles kind of give you that feel of the dark and dirtiness. It's not clean, happy fantasy. This is the back streets, the dingy areas, and stuff like that. The places you don't really want to go.
Yes. So what did you think of the theme and the storytelling, the adventure, if you like, overall?
I thought the storytelling quality was pretty good. I mean, we're talking as close to Tainted Grail as something I've played. I thought the snippets were great. The snippets were really nice because they weren't like telling. Well, the whole thing told a longer story, but because the scenarios were very short scenarios, it was like a very intimate small selection of text in a book. You're talking maybe like a chapter in a short story, as in this is what happens here, and the story feeds around that. It's not telling you this massive expansive narrative. It's focusing down on the nitty gritty, the small things, which gave it the whole thing felt very story-like, much more than most, if any, games I've ever played.
They do it with, each scenario has its own book here, and you kind of go through, and some of them, like it gives you a map which you set up, and the sort of setup details here, and then some objectives you complete, like many cooperative adventures really. And then they have other sections, which are, if I can find one. Yeah, where you have a kind of, there's more story text, and there isn't a map as such. You're trying to achieve an objective in a slightly different way.
It's
more
like
abstract.
A scene that joins the other scenes together.
Yes. And the way you move through the book, I think, is really nice. It's not quite a choose your own adventure in that you're not deciding which way to go next, but there are multiple branching paths as you go through this. And which way you go depends on how you do in each scenario. So if you do very well, you might find if you kill lots of baddies in one scenario, there aren't as many baddies in the next scenario, so you make your life easier, if you like.
Yeah.
One slight issue with that is it does tend to, like, you need to kind of stay ahead of the curve. If things go wrong, it can snowball because it's harder because you didn't do as well in this scenario. There isn't really a catch-up mechanic as such that I've seen.
No, and you can clearly fail in this and get the bad ending.
So at the end, it kind of ranges from kind of major victory to minor victory to minor defeat to major defeat. I mean, it can go really horribly wrong. But in terms of the story, a lot of it comes from Robert E. Howard, I think is the guy who wrote the original Solomon Kane stories, and they've used a lot of his text directly from the books. So it does, I think, capture the theme really well from that point of view. In terms of me feeling like I'm on an adventure, it puts me there.
I feel like if I read the narrative that produced this ultimately, I'd go, oh yeah, this feels seamless into that, I'd hope. It feels so, I mean, without reading I can't say that 100%, but because the narrative quality is so good, I believe that they've taken a proper look at the property and tried to keep it as faithful as possible.
Yeah. Some scenarios are much longer. I don't know if you can see, but this is quite a thin one. But some of them have like much thicker books or multiple books. Some of them go on much longer. And as Mark says, it's nice. You can vary from a relatively short scenario to something that you would take several days. So potentially, certainly you'd have to do it over several evenings. You couldn't get it all done in one evening for the longest scenarios. There is a save system which I've tried to avoid using. Essentially, I've set it up, played it, and if it takes more than one evening, I just leave it on the table and we keep playing it because there's just so much setup time. Is an issue, I think.
Yeah, I think the initial setup's an issue because you have to get all the miniatures, get all the quotes. There are I've seen games with much more decks. There's no Arkham Horror with number of decks.
Yeah.
But you do it gives you like a list of all the stuff that you're going to see. So you get that all together, which is good for speed. Yeah. But if you're playing a many multi-part campaign, I don't know if you get everything in one go in that case, or whether it feeds you them through in.
It's split into acts,
yeah,
so
which
each act
makes it a bit easier for table play. But yeah, I think the other negative with that is because the scenarios themselves are actually relatively short. They're well length. As in, I feel like by the time I finish playing it, I felt a good amount of game on a single scenario, but you're having to balance the fact that you do have to set them up. Any that use the board anyway, you'll have to set up. And you also have to learn the specific rules for that scenario, because they'll all, from what I've seen, they all have their own little bit special rules to set, which is great. But it does add extra setup time on something that's actually can be relatively short. I mean, one of the scenarios we played, in theory, we could have beat in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
We just chose not to. But we could have spent 10 minutes of setup time, or nearly 10 minutes, to play a 10-minute scenario. That's not common. That's the extreme. I'm going to say that. But from what I gather, none of the scenarios are. We're not talking an hour a scenario. These are 30
shorter.
to 45 minutes. Well, because they are small and granular in detail, you're doing a small snippet of a chapter or something like that.
So one adventure, if you like this, might have 10 different chapters. And of that, 5 or 6 of them might have boards like this where you're getting tiles out and you get the relevant miniatures and you set it all up. And as Mark says, sometimes they can be quite short, but they're never really that long.
Yeah.
So there is that setup between missions as well. Personally, I don't mind the setup at all because the game has such an expansive amount of content and playability and time and all the rest of it. I don't mind investing the setup time because it repays that with dividends, I think, in terms of your experience of playing the game. So coming on to actually playing the game, what do we think of the mechanics?
Well, the dice mechanics are nice. So it is dice based. The dice affect the actions you have available, but they're not.
The actions are laid out as cards, hopefully, aren't they? And you roll your dice, just to be clear here. And depending on what you get, you're matching symbols with what goes on the card. So if I match this symbol and that symbol, then this card does whatever it says it does.
But I don't feel like they're heavily limiting. A lot of things have outs. You get the option to either re-roll or flip a dice.
Yeah. You
can pass a person. So if you don't use your dice, you can give them a dice for next turn if you see if they're going to need it, which is nice. Because I guess there's a bits and pieces of this that don't have. We are cooperating together, but we have very little indirect, other than that, actual doing stuff. But I guess that's not really an issue because we are cooperating, so we're constantly talking anyway. But that being able to pass your dice just makes me feel like we're even more cooperating than just. Say, I'm trying to think, if you have a cooperative game where you're just, I move my miniature around, you move your miniature around, we deal with things separately, and you maybe have the character, or you can swap a card. The dice transfer feels like more than that, than just swapping a card.
Yeah.
It has more effect, especially considering you go, well, you need that symbol.
Yeah.
And be able, if you can do that card, it's better for you to have this dice and me to do something else.
Because the virtues you play are each quite specialised.
Yes.
So this virtue, courage, is great at fighting. And if it's a scenario where we need to do a lot of fighting, then maybe Mark needs to be passing me dice more so that we can do the fighting we need to do. But then after that, maybe we need to do some exploring, and there's another virtue that's great at exploring and finding things, and so maybe at that point I need to be passing Mark the dice. So it does feel more cooperative. You need to tailor what you're doing to the best virtues you've got at the time.
Yeah. So I really like the dice mechanic. It works well. It's actually, when playing, it's actually quite smooth. As in, your actions go around pretty quickly. The biggest difficulty I think we found, even you with having plenty of experience with it, is that you said it's quite keyword heavy at times, and if you miss a keyword, you can have quite a big effect on the game. The keywords balance the fact that it allows you to have more narrative depth and speciality in things.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that does have difficulties. It's a much harder game as a teacher, I suspect, than as somebody who's being taught. And that will affect some people. If you would struggle to teach something this heavy, it might be a little bit of a slog.
The learning curve is tough, I'll warn you. It took me quite a long time, having played through probably a couple of these adventures before I really got my head around what I was doing. At the back of the rulebook has several pages worth of these keywords. As Mark says, it's not so much what you're doing. What you're doing is straightforward. You use this action, says move one. Great, I can move Solomon Kane one space. This says fight. Great, I roll my dice for fight. But in terms of how the AI works, all the enemies, how they move, it's often tricky. Certain characters, it has the hunter keyword, and so you have to look at what does a hunter do, and they all move together.
Because you're essentially following a list of actions that the enemy might take, and you're trying to work, well, who's a hunter, who's going to do that, and balancing it off until those keywords appear in those small snippet rules at the start.
Yep.
So if you've glossed over those and you forget about it while you're still mid setup, you're actually going to hurt yourself on that. But it does give it a much stronger ability to do a lot more things.
Yes.
It's deep, incredibly deep.
Each scenario can be very different from the next one. You may not do any fighting at all in some scenarios. It might be about talking to people, trying to persuade the local barmaid to give you some information about somebody who came through the inn last week. The variety is great, but it comes at a cost. It's going to take you a while to get your head around all the keywords.
Talking about the combat, I really liked it. The combat is based on, you essentially have tables, essentially you check, don't you, depending on the situation, to what card. And the cards are themed to the enemy. So you will get the enemy will do things that the enemy will do that would be different to what a different enemy. A wolf will do something different to a man, for instance.
So these thugs, depending on what result you get, I'll explain the results in a second, you can see it says at the top here, a cowardly thug whistles for one of his cronies. He calls someone else in.
So I think that's great. It does slow it down a little bit than something the way you just chuck some dice. But again, you're forsaking the speed for text that makes sense.
Yeah, indeed.
And because there's enough enemy types, you're not generally going to see the same thing read again and again and again. It will happen from time to time. If you're seeing thugs in 5 games, they're all going to act like thugs. But because they're going to be so broken up with other things that you're fighting, you're not going to be reading that text every other game, if you know what I mean. So it's fine, it doesn't matter, but it does add to the atmosphere of how things are going on, while just chucking dice wouldn't do that.
It's hard to explain quite how the system works. I've never really seen anything quite like it, because you keep looking at these things. So for that particular result, incidentally, there's you draw cards to get random numbers, essentially, and you add that to your own strength of your abilities. You can power up your abilities as you go through the game and make yourself better at fighting. But depending on what result you get, how well you attack or how badly they attack you, if you like, you're then drawing from another deck of cards that has all these fight effects in. And this might be the enemy takes a wound, or you lose one of your stats, or it varies enormously. So the fights, again, feel very different each time you play them, depending on the particular characters you're fighting against. So again, that variety, because of the system, is really unusual in a game like this.
I think you should cover the tracks as well before I forget, because they're prominent there, and they're intentionally so.
So essentially, you've got 3 stats for Solomon Kane: strength, clarity, and compassion, and they help you in different ways. So if you're fighting, obviously, the higher your strength is, the more of a bonus you get. And the shadows, they're called, which are the equivalent to the virtues. If you're like angels, these are sort of like demons. And as they get closer to Solomon Kane, they influence him negatively and make it harder to do the various tests. Basically, they reduce the numbers you're getting when you're trying to fight and things. But yes, constantly you're trying to push up your stats to make yourself better at fighting, for instance. But the various game effects are then pushing them down. And the interesting thing is that some of the actions you can take, some of the cards you put out, you can get a very cheap action that does something you really need to do, but it will move one of your stats down, which means in the future you're not going to be as good. So that was really interesting. The final one then is the danger track, which essentially determines how many of these shadows are spawning on the various purple spawn points around here. But yeah, I'll just give you a quick close-up of the set of tracks here. So you can see the strength, clarity and compassion, those are Solomon Kane stats, and the danger at the bottom. You want to keep this as low as you can.
Yes.
The story chapters, which come between the scenario chapters if you like, often affect the stats quite a bit. You're trying to get light is a very important resource in the game. You're putting resource out to light your way if you like. And if you do well on those story chapters, then it will either increase your stats or decrease the danger, and that can help you a lot in subsequent scenarios. So although they're quite, there's a lot of text and you're not really doing anything on the board, they can feel really important, like key, as you say, connecting moments between the different scenarios.
I do also like the way that that these affect the board, because you have to understand your indirect, indirect's not fair, but you don't have full direct control over Solomon. It depends what actions available to either on your own one, or if you've not got 4 players, you have access to the actions of the other ones that you don't. So you essentially, if I don't have a move action available, I cannot move him. If this isn't a game where Solomon moves to attack, stuff like that, I need that ability to be able to available to me to access it. And so balancing, making sure you have the right actions available between you as well is important, because these cards are they're a deck that's specific to this, and you essentially split half and half, something like that at the start. So yes. I kind of know what's coming up, and you're balancing between that. So you've got a modicum of control, but not really full. It is ultimately, some extent, randomised. And you can also just get rid of these at the end of your action. If you're like, I'm not going to use that. So because the decks are so short, you do cycle through very quickly, which is important.
Yeah. I really like the puzzle solving aspect of that, because as Mark says, it's not easy necessarily for Solomon Kane to move here and attack. You need to have the right combination of dice or cards or abilities on other virtues, and trying to decide how best to use your dice. You know, maybe you are best just going all out, using all your dice and all your reserves and everything all at once for a big attack, or maybe you're better being just careful this round, donating some dice, letting Mark have a turn first, and then you can build up for a better turn next time if you like. It is very puzzly at times. Not heavily so, but it's an important part of the game. If you don't like puzzles, you're going to, I think, get frustrated with it. I just want to be able to move him.
This isn't a combat game in the way of... There is fighting in it, but that isn't the focus of it. Yeah. In fact, you can have scenarios where you do not fight at all. You can choose to go a different path, and that's really good. One question I do have to ask, is the game length fixed, relevant to the number of players? Is in you get a certain number, because there's a clock fundamentally, which is the...
Yes, that doesn't depend on the number of players.
So it's always fixed. So I will say that I suspect this is better at the lower end, because... Because fundamentally, if we're playing 4 players, I'm going to get half the number of actions I would do as 2 players. And that's...
I would never play this at 4 players. I just think it would be too slow, But
the thing is, a 2, that's probably quite nice, because you get the balance of... Well, we do get to do the dice sharing and stuff, which is important and fun. But we also know there are actions coming around really, really soon after. I think 3 and 4, you're just going to start losing too many actions. So it's really, for me, a solo or a 2-player game.
Yes, 2-player is fantastic. It works really well solo as well. 3, it's okay, but I would avoid 4-player. There's a kind of 1 versus many option you can play the game in as well, or a kind of... the base game is you're all competitive essentially. But there's options there if you want to play it in different ways. But the normal way, the cooperative way they played it, I really like, and I think it works really, really well. Final thoughts then?
So my final thought would be, this is probably the best narrative experience I play in a game. And I'm going to say it because I feel like I move into a chapter, I do the things of a chapter in let's say in a short story, because it's intimate, it's not massive branching, and so I really, really, really feel like I'm playing through a book. It's not one big narrative, it's lots of small scenes, and I think I've not played a game that's captured that so well, and that's much more suits me. It's kind of down to, I don't know if we ever said this in the video before, but we discussed, if you compare Eldritch Horror to Arkham Horror, I prefer Arkham Horror. Why do I prefer Arkham Horror? Because I'm going for a town rather than the world. I like the slightly more small scale stuff. I think it feels like I'm more there, and this goes that one step again. It's like loads of small scenes of doing stuff like that, And so if I was rating it on narrative alone, I'd give it a 10 because of that. It's that good, and I couldn't fault it. I'm gonna have to knock stuff off for the fact if I had to teach it, that'd be hard. I don't think it's better than a two-player game. I think it can. As I said, the rules can be fiddly. I think the setup time will annoy some people if you have a really short scenario, especially if you're playing a one-player game, because you'll be motoring through it and you've just set it up and you've already finished, and that would be even more annoying. But you're trading all that in and all the bloat with reading the cards for the thing, like for the action stuff, like for the attacking and all that stuff. But it really feels like you're in that situation. So much more than most games I've played. And so, yeah, as a narrative experience, and to some extent enjoying the puzzle bit as well, it is fantastic.
Okay.
Oh, and the other negative being, it's 2 boxes. I don't know how they're going to do a retail release. I just don't think it's possible. Unless they did them as standees, I don't actually see how this could do a retail release, because you'd have to have 2 boxes tied together or plastic. You can't play it as a single box game. It doesn't exist.
Doesn't work. You need both.
So it's like, I don't know how you make this a retail release.
Yeah. I love it. Absolutely love it. I mean, I love adventure games. They are my bread and butter, and this one is fantastic. As Mark says, there are issues with setup time and fiddliness because of all the keywords. The fights, to start with, are going to feel very slow. It's like, now we look at this, now we get this card, oh, and that means this, and that was 1 hit. Now on to the next hit. Now we look at this card, but once you get the hang of it, it is smooth. Once you know all the keywords and you understand how it all works, it's fine. But it's just quite fiddly to start with. The learning curve, as I say, is really high. So I would be on a 9 out of 10, like a really solid 9 out of 10. And if it wasn't for the fiddliness and the learning curve and the setup, it would be a 10. As Mark says, the narrative, the adventure is fantastic. It really grabs you and you feel like you're going through the adventure. You feel like you are affecting events. It does a great job.
And I would give it based on that, I would give it a 10 for the story, but probably a 9 once you take off the negatives. But they are all to be worth persevering with. I think you would know if this is going to be too much.
Yeah.
You could probably just look at the table and go, it's probably going to be a bit much for me. But for everybody who's got even a slight consideration, go for it. Just jump into it. If you've got to play a few times solo, go for it. But give yourself the time to do it, and it'll be very rewarding.
Yeah, that is the word. It is really rewarding as long as you're happy to put the time in. All right, well, thanks very much for watching. That was Solomon Kane. We will see you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.